let's start at the very beginning. If the microcrystals are calcium oxalate, calcium, we get calcium in our diet. Everybody knows that. It's an ion. It's going to be water soluble, pretty straightforward to think about. Calcium is used for all sorts of stuff throughout the body. It reacts with these things called oxalates. What are those and where do they come from?
Yeah, so oxalate is a normal metabolic waste product that we make day in, day out. And, it comes from things like hydroxyproline, which is in our collagen, for example, and a few other compounds that get metabolized to oxalate. And the body cannot degrade oxalate any further. So you have to pee it out. You have to get rid of it mostly for the kidney. And usually the endogenous production of oxalate is not a problem. The kidneys have evolved to deal with that. The problem comes in if we also eat a lot of oxalate with our food or ingest it. Where does oxalate come from in nature? It actually comes from plants. So many plants use oxalate essentially as a defense, as a poison. Because plants, it turns out, they don't want to be eaten, most of them. So they try to be toxic to animals that want to eat them, let's say humans. So if you go out in nature and, start eating like 100 different species of plants, probably 95 of them will eventually kill you if you eat enough of it. So usually plants are very toxic. Only very few plants, have become food for us humans, but they still do contain oxalate, just, like lower amounts. But some are still off the charts, things like spinach, for example, that's probably the most common one that can cause oxalate problems. So spinach contains a huge amount of oxalate. I would consider it a non-edible toxic plant, actually. So I'm not quite sure why it is allowed to be in our food supply. But yep. So you can absolutely overeat on, say, spinach, and some
Wow.
people like to make like spinach smoothies or
Yeah, yeah.
spinach juice or something.
That would
If
probably actually just increase the bioavailability of the oxalates.
Oh, yes, right. So, and there are many case reports in the literature where, somebody, consumed, a few too many spinach juices and ends up with acute kidney injury, what we talked about before. And they're in the hospital, and sometimes they might even
Wow.
lose their kidneys that way.
Wow. So Popeye the Sailor Man probably had kidney stones.
Very possible. Right.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, so the oxalates are essentially, they're in most plants to some level. Many plants have them at very high levels, and they sort of have them for the reason of defense. They actually don't want, most plants don't want to be eaten most of the time. And if they are eaten by herbivores, herbivores are animals that probably have evolved special adaptations to detox these plants in certain ways. And so in a species like ours, which doesn't have those detox mechanisms, you can run into problems by consuming plants with high levels of things like oxalates. And it
Right.
sounds like you said, basically, there's the things that we consider edible vegetables represent, a tiny slice of the plant world that just doesn't have especially high levels of things like oxalates and presumably a lot of other things. But you're saying in one case, spinach, we do commonly think of this as an edible food plant. But what you're saying is it actually has high enough levels of oxalates that you think that's basically a mistake.
Yeah, I would probably say so, and especially since spinach is promoted as a healthy food, and
Mm-hmm.
you see it on the internet all day long. A nephrologist friend of mine told me once that he had a patient who um, heard on the internet that spinach is good for your health. So she said, all right, if a little bit of spinach is good for your health, more spinach is more good for your health. So you eat spinach all day long. And that person then, showed up at in the nephrology clinic with acute kidney injury. And that happens with other foods as well. Many nuts are very high in oxalate, almonds, peanuts, for example.
Really?
Another nephrologist friend told me of a person who was binge eating peanuts, which is very easy to do because it
Yeah.
tastes so good, right?
Yeah.
And you end up with acute kidney injury potentially.
Yeah. The more I've learned about nutrients and toxins and bioavailability across foods over the years, the more I realize how backwards thinking often is. So for example, just to take the case of peanuts, you're saying not only do they contain oxalates, so if you eat more peanuts, you're going to have more oxalates and a higher chance of getting kidney stones. But people, for example, think of peanuts as a good source of protein. And while they contain a lot of protein, it's not very bioavailable. So there's a lot of people out there eating peanuts, not realizing that they're getting oxalates, which will promote kidney stones, and thinking falsely that they're getting a lot of protein when in fact they're only getting a fraction of what's inside of it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Any other common foods that have like fairly high levels of oxalates that maybe people should know about besides spinach?
Yeah, so things like rhubarb, that's not so common in the US, but in I'm from Germany. When I was a kid, I love to eat rhubarb. When it's rhubarb season, that's pretty high in oxalate. Things like dragon fruit, and many essentially. I think I would say by default, you would want to suspect that something is high in oxalates. There's actually like tables of oxalate content of different foods. So it's a good idea. If somebody has kidney stone problem, you probably want to look at a list like that and maybe flag for yourself the things that are kind of very high in oxalate and say, oh, okay, let me stay away from those.
Yeah. But it's based on everything you've said so far. Obviously, some things have higher levels of oxalates, like spinach, but it sounds like most plants or a high percentage of plants are going to have some amount of oxalates.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, things like Swiss chard, for example, again promoted as a health food. It's also very high. Yeah, and then that's why juicing may be a bad idea for many people, right?
Wow.
Especially juicing, because you end up you start with a large amount of spinach, whatever it is, and you condense it down to a tiny little drink. You gulp it down
all at once. Yeah.
Right, and maybe you have another one after that. So the intake can be quite high.